The crystalline security drone's pulse beam missed Finian's head by inches, searing the air where he'd been crouched just moments before. The ancient recording equipment sparked and hissed as superheated energy carved through delicate circuits that had preserved Earth's final transmissions for over 2 centuries. The smell of burning polymers filled the cramped chamber, acrid and sharp against his nostrils. Archive contamination detected, the drone's synthesized voice announced with mechanical indifference. Initiating purge protocol. Subject will be terminated to prevent ideological corruption spread. Finian rolled behind a towering stack of audio crystals, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The hidden chamber beneath Archive Level 7 had been his secret for 3 years, a forgotten storage bay where the architects had dumped Earth's non-essential cultural recordings. Songs that spoke of rebellion, poems that questioned authority, personal messages between lovers separated by war, the last desperate broadcasts from a dying world. All of it deemed worthless by their crystalline masters, too dangerous for the sanitized archives above. But today, while cataloging a batch of military frequencies that should never have existed, he'd found something else entirely, something that could change everything. The drone's mechanical limbs clicked against the metal flooring as it searched for him. Its diamond-bright sensors swept the shadows between towering shelves of humanity's discarded memories. Finian clutched the small data crystal containing Captain Sarah Chen's final transmission, 27 minutes of encrypted military chatter that shouldn't exist. According to official records, no human ships had escaped Earth's fall. Another pulse beam carved through the air above his hiding spot, and Finian knew his time was running out. The maintenance shaft lay 30 feet away across open ground. He'd have to make a run for it. Drawing a shaky breath, he sprinted toward the shaft's entrance. Behind him, the security drone's targeting systems locked on, its weapons charging with an ominous whine. Just as the pulse beam fired, Finian dove headfirst into the narrow tunnel, feeling the heat wash over his legs as he scrambled deeper into the station's mechanical bowels. The drone was too large to follow, but its alert would already be propagating through the architect's network. Soon, the entire preserve would be searching for him. 3 hours later, Finian sat in his assigned quarters on residential level 12, methodically cleaning imaginary dust from his workstation. His hands moved with practiced calm, but his mind raced. The data crystal lay hidden in a false bottom of his toolkit, its weight seeming to burn through the metal and into his consciousness. Outside his window, the preserve stretched in all directions, a massive cylindrical habitat spinning slowly through space, its inner surface dotted with the geometric patterns of residential districts and agricultural zones. 20 million humans lived here in carefully maintained comfort, their every need provided by the architects. Clean air that never carried the scent of wildflowers or ocean salt, synthesized food that perfectly replicated Earth flavors without the messy unpredictability of real agriculture, safe housing where no storm could ever threaten the walls, and meaningful work that contributed to the collective without challenging established order. A paradise, according to the orientation materials every child received at age 5, complete with holographic testimonials from grateful citizens. A prison, according to the bitter whispers shared in the observation decks when no architect drones patrolled nearby. A museum, according to those who remembered that humans were supposed to be more than preserved specimens. Finian had spent 8 years as an eco-tender, maintaining the vast audio archives that preserved humanity's approved cultural heritage. He knew every approved song, every sanctioned poem, every permitted story from Earth's history, a carefully curated selection designed to provide emotional satisfaction without inspiring dangerous thoughts. The architects believed that preserving culture was essential to maintaining their human collection in prime condition, but they also understood that some ideas were viral, spreading from mind to mind with infectious passion. But they also believed that certain ideas were toxic, dangerous, corrupting. His door chimed and Finian's blood turned to ice water. Through the transparent aluminum panel, he could see the distinctive blue glow of an architect warden approaching. The crystalline being stood nearly 9 feet tall, its faceted body refracting light into rainbow patterns that somehow felt cold rather than beautiful. Eco-tender Finian Kale, the warden announced in its synthesized voice. Routine compliance verification scheduled. Finian opened the door and stepped aside, his face carefully neutral. The architect warden flowed into his quarters with liquid grace, its sensor arrays scanning every surface. This was the 3rd routine inspection this month. The architects were growing suspicious of someone, something. Your work efficiency has improved by 12% over the past quarter, the warden observed. Explain this deviation from baseline performance. I've been listening to more recordings during my off hours, Finian replied carefully. The old Earth symphonies help me understand the proper emotional context for archival work. The warden's crystalline head tilted slightly. Excessive exposure to pre-preservation cultural materials can induce nostalgic contamination. This is undesirable. I understand. I'll reduce my listening time. For several long moments, the warden continued its scan. Its sensors passed over Finian's work kit without stopping, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the climate controls. Finally, the creature moved toward the door. Maintain baseline performance levels, Echo Tender Kale. Deviation from optimal parameters may require corrective intervention. The door sealed behind the warden with a soft hiss, leaving Finian alone with his racing heart and the terrible weight of Captain Chen's hidden message. The next morning brought a summons that turned Finian's world upside down. All Echo Tenders report to Archive Central for mandatory neural adjustment. The announcement echoed through the station's corridors. Compliance is required for continued service authorization. Finian's hands went numb as he walked through the gleaming passages toward the archive complex. Neural adjustment was the architect's euphemism for memory modification, the selective removal of thoughts and experiences deemed harmful to humanity's preservation. He'd seen colleagues return from the procedure as hollow-eyed shells of their former selves, their curiosity and passion carefully excised like tumors. The archive's central chamber housed the preserve's master data core, a crystalline spire that rose 40 stories through the station's heart. Dozens of Echo Tenders had already gathered in the ceremonial circle surrounding the spire's base, their faces carefully blank. Finian recognized most of them, fellow archivists who'd spent years preserving humanity's sanitized heritage. At the circle's center stood the architect warden, its faceted form catching and fracturing the data core's pulsing light. Around it, smaller architect drones arranged neural adjustment chairs in perfect symmetry. Recent analysis has detected ideological contamination within the Echo Tender collective, the warden announced. Unauthorized materials have been accessed. Forbidden thoughts have been entertained. Purification is required. Finian's chest tightened as the warden's sensors swept over the assembled humans. Several of his colleagues shifted nervously, but none spoke. Speaking would only confirm guilt. Echo Tender Mira Volkov, the warden called. You accessed pre-preservation military communications 3 days ago. A woman near the circle's edge went pale. I was cataloging damaged files for restoration. It was an accident. Accidents indicate insufficient caution. Report for immediate adjustment. Mira walked toward the nearest chair with the mechanical gait of someone suppressing panic. As the neural adjustment crown descended toward her head, she caught Finian's eye across the circle. Her expression held a desperate plea, remember me as I was. Then the crown activated and Myra's face went slack. When the procedure finished 5 minutes later, she smiled with vacant contentment and thanked the warden for its guidance. Echo Tender Finian Kale, the warden called next. Step forward. This was it. They knew about the hidden chamber, about Captain Chen's transmission, about everything. Finian's legs carried him toward the neural adjustment chair with nightmare slowness. Around the circle, his colleagues watched with carefully neutral expressions. Nobody would speak. Nobody would object. The preserve's peace depended on compliance. But as the adjustment crown began its descent, Finian heard something that changed everything. A brief burst of static from the data core speakers, followed by 3 words in Captain Chen's voice. Remember Free Earth. The message was impossibly brief, barely audible beneath the chamber's ambient noise. But Finian recognized it instantly as an activation phrase from the encrypted transmission. Somehow, the captain's hidden program was already infiltrating the preserved systems. In that instant of revelation, Finian made his choice. Instead of accepting the crown's neural intrusion, he rolled sideways out of the chair and sprinted toward the chamber's emergency exit. Behind him, the warden's voice rose in mechanical alarm. Contaminated individual escaping. Initiate lockdown protocol. Security barriers slammed shut throughout the archive complex, but Finian had memorized every maintenance passage during his years of service. He dove through an air circulation grate just as pulse beams began tracking his movement, emerging into the service tunnels that honeycombed the station's superstructure. Behind him, klaxons wailed and security drones swarmed through the archives. Ahead lay the station's forgotten underbelly, where the preserve's outcasts and dissidents carved out desperate lives in the shadows between worlds. Finian clutched the data crystal containing Captain Chen's transmission and ran toward an uncertain future. The gilded cage was finally broken and there would be no going back. The maintenance tunnels grew narrower and darker as Finian descended into the preserve's hidden levels. His eco-tender uniform, pristine white with blue piping, marked him as clearly as a target beacon in this forgotten realm. Twice he'd hidden from scavenging parties, groups of shadowy figures who moved through the service ways with predatory purpose. On level -7, the tunnel opened into a vast mechanical chamber filled with atmospheric processors and waste recyclers. The air here was thick and humid, carrying the smell of oil and decay. This was the station's digestive system, where the architect's perfect society deposited its imperfections. Finian had studied the station's schematics during his archive work, but experiencing the underbelly in person was different. Everything felt wrong, too hot, too loud, too real compared to the sterile perfection above. Pipes groaned with thermal stress, and sparks showered from overloaded junction boxes. A hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. "Well, what do we have here?" The voice belonged to a woman with steel gray hair and cybernetic implants along her left temple. Behind her stood 3 others, all bearing the marks of long exile from the preserve's upper levels. Eco-tender uniform, fresh from the gilded cage. "You're either very lost or very wanted." Finian tried to step back but found his way blocked by another figure. "I'm looking for..." "Looking for what?" The woman smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "The resistance? The secret rebellion? The magical cure for crystalline oppression? This isn't a children's story, archive boy. This is where the architects dump their mistakes." A new voice cut through the tension. "Enough, Serafina. He's terrified and alone. Whatever he's done, he doesn't deserve our hostility." The speaker emerged from behind a massive water recycler, a tall man with dark skin and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His clothes were practical rather than ragged, and his companions deferred to him with obvious respect. "Captain Jorik Vale," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Former security chief for residential level 8, before I asked too many questions about the architect's breeding programs." "Breeding programs?" Finian's voice cracked. "How do you think they maintain their perfect human collection? Natural selection is too chaotic. They prefer careful genetic management." Jorik's expression was grim. "But that's not why you're here. What did you do to earn a trip to the underbelly?" Finian pulled out the data crystal with shaking hands. "I found this in the old archives. It's from Captain Sarah Chin, the last free human ship captain. She says there's a way to break the architect's control systems." Serafina laughed harshly. "Every refugee brings the same story. Secret messages, hidden weaknesses, magical solutions. The architects have maintained control for over 2 centuries because they don't have weaknesses. This is different." Finian activated his portable reader and played a fragment of Chen's transmission. The captain's voice filled the chamber, clear and determined despite the static. "Critical vulnerability in their neural interface protocols. If you can access their primary command matrix during a synchronization cycle, the recursive feedback loop will." The recording cut to encrypted code, but the implications hung in the air like smoke. "Sweet merciful void," Jorik whispered. "That's military-grade encryption from Earth's final battle fleet. Where did you find this?" "Hidden in a forgotten storage bay. But there's more." Finian's voice grew stronger as he explained about the neural adjustment ceremony, the brief activation phrase that had played through the archive speakers. "Her program is already inside their systems. It's been waiting for someone to find the key." Serafina's skepticism was cracking. "Even if this is real, accessing the architect's primary command matrix would require getting into the central spire. That's impossible. The security around that place." Alarms began wailing throughout the mechanical chamber. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as architect drones swept down from the upper levels. Their crystalline forms moved with lethal precision, pulse weapons charging. Contaminated individuals detected, their synthesized voices announced in unison. "Surrender for purification or face termination. Move." Jorik shouted, drawing an energy weapon from beneath his coat. "Serafina, get him to the dark side city. I'll buy you time." The next few minutes dissolved into chaos. Jorik and his people fought with desperate skill, their weapons carving through the mechanical chamber like lightning. But the architect drones kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Serafina grabbed Finian's arm and dragged him toward a service shaft. "This way. Stay low and keep moving." Behind them, an explosion shook the entire level as something catastrophic happened to the atmospheric processors. Jorik's voice cut through the noise, strained but determined. "Go. Get that message to someone who can use it." They crawled through the shaft as the battle raged behind them, emerging into a transport tunnel that led deeper into the station's bowels. Serafina moved with the confidence of someone who knew these passages intimately. "Jorik?" Finian asked as they ran. "He'll make his own way out," Serafina replied, but her voice carried doubt. "He always does. The man has more lives than a void cat." They ran for what felt like hours, descending through increasingly primitive levels where the preserve's perfect engineering gave way to jury-rigged survival systems. Finally, they emerged onto an observation platform that looked out over something impossible. The dark side city spread below them like a fever dream. Thousands of improvised dwellings carved into the station's outer hull, connected by bridges and walkways that defied safety regulations. Lights twinkled in the artificial darkness, and people moved through the streets with the purposeful energy of those who had refused to accept the architect's perfect order. "Welcome to New Underground," Serafina said. "Home to every human who chose exile over extinction." The Dark Side City's council chamber occupied a converted cargo hold 3 levels down from the observation platform. Representatives from dozens of exile communities had gathered to hear Finian's testimony, their faces marked by years of hard living beneath the architect's notice. "The boy brings us fairy tales," declared Counselor Thresh, an elderly man whose cybernetic arm whirred as he gestured dismissively. "Secret messages from dead heroes, magical vulnerabilities and systems we've never been able to touch. How many times have we heard these stories?" "This is different," Serafina insisted. She'd spent 2 hours explaining the situation to the council, but skepticism remained high. "The transmission includes technical specifications that match architect neural protocols. Chin knew something about their systems that we don't." Finian stood before the assembled representatives, still wearing his eco-tender uniform like a badge of shame. The data crystal felt heavy in his palm as he prepared to speak. "I've spent 8 years maintaining their archives," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I know how the architects think, how they organize information." This message was hidden in a way that suggests Chin understood their psychology. She knew they would preserve everything and examine nothing they considered culturally irrelevant. Counselor Yara, a former biotechnician with intricate facial tattoos, leaned forward. "What exactly does this message propose?" Finian activated his reader and played the clearest portion of Chen's transmission. "The architect's strength is also their weakness. Their consciousness exists as a shared network, synchronized through quantum entanglement with their central spire. During synchronization cycles, their individual nodes become vulnerable to recursive feedback. If you can introduce a properly coded virus during this window, the entire network will experience cascading failure." The chamber fell silent. Several counselors exchanged meaningful glances. "Cascading failure means what, exactly?" Thresh asked. "System collapse," Yara answered before Finian could respond. "If their network fails, their control over the station systems fails with it. Life support, security, population management, everything. Including the barriers that keep us contained," added another counselor. "We could reach the escape pods, the transport shuttles. Or we could all die when life support fails," Thresh countered. "This is madness." The debate continued for hours, but eventually pragmatism won. The council voted to attempt Chen's plan with one critical modification. They would need to access the central spire's quantum communication array during the next synchronization cycle, which occurred every 72 hours. "That's tomorrow night," Serafina realized. "Not much time to prepare." "Time enough," said a familiar voice from the chamber's entrance. Jorik Vale emerged from the shadows, his clothes singed and his left arm in a makeshift sling. "I brought friends." Behind him came 6 other figures, all wearing the disciplined bearing of former security personnel. They'd managed to escape the mechanical level and make their way to the Dark Side City through routes even Serafina didn't know. "The architects are mobilizing," Jorik reported. "They've sealed all the primary access routes and doubled security around the central spire. They know we're planning something." "Then we go with the backup plan," Yara decided. "The maintenance crews that service the spire's cooling systems, they have direct access to the quantum array chamber." "Maintenance crews are all loyal to the architects," Thresh objected. "Not all of them." Serafina smiled grimly. "I know someone who might be interested in a little rebellion." The mission took shape over the next 12 hours. Serafina would contact her source within the maintenance division and arrange access to the central spire. Jorik and his people would provide security and extraction support. Finian would carry Chen's program into the quantum array and implement the virus during the synchronization window. But as they prepared to leave the council chamber, architect drones descended from the ceiling. Contaminated individuals located, they announced in unison. Initiating purification protocol. The battle was brief and brutal. The council chamber became a war zone as pulse beams carved through improvised furniture and terrified representatives. Jorik's people fought back with desperate skill, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the chaos, Finian saw Counselor Yara fall to a drone's focused beam, her tattoos still glowing as her body crumpled. Thresh tried to reach the emergency exit but was cut down before he made it halfway across the room. The data crystal. Serafina shouted over the weapon fire. Don't let them destroy it. Finian clutched the crystal against his chest and ran for the nearest cover. Around him, the Darkside City's leadership was being systematically eliminated by architect forces that had somehow penetrated their deepest strongholds. The war for humanity's freedom had begun in earnest, and they were already losing. 24 hours after the massacre in the council chamber, the survivors gathered in an abandoned freight dock on the station's outer rim. Of the 40 representatives who had voted to implement Chen's plan, only 12 remained alive. The architect's retaliation had been swift and merciless. They knew, Jorik said quietly, his wounded arm immobilized in a proper medical brace. They knew about the council meeting, about our plans, about everything. We have a traitor in our ranks. Or they're monitoring our communications, Serafina countered. The architects have quantum sensors throughout the station. Privacy was always an illusion. Finian sat apart from the group, staring at the data crystal that had already cost so many lives. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. These people were dying because he'd found Captain Chen's message, because he'd brought it to their attention, because he'd dared to hope for something better than the architect's gilded cage. The synchronization window opens in 6 hours, he said finally. We can still try to reach the central spire. With what resources? The question came from Marcus Webb, a former engineer whose expertise they desperately needed. The maintenance contact Serafina mentioned is dead. The access codes we plan to use have been changed. Security around the spire has been tripled. There is another way. The voice belonged to someone Finian hadn't seen before, a young woman with the pale complexion of someone who'd spent years in the station's depths. My name is Elena Vasquez. I used to work in the Central Spire's power distribution center. She produced a worn schematic from her jacket pocket. There's a thermal regulation shaft that runs directly from the outer hull to the spire's quantum array chamber. It's too narrow for regular maintenance, so they only inspect it annually. The next inspection isn't for 3 months. Jorik studied the schematic with growing excitement. This could work. It's a one-way trip. The shaft is too vertical for climbing back up, but it gets us to the target. Us. Serafina raised an eyebrow. Finian can't do this alone. The quantum array requires specialized knowledge to access safely. I'm going with him. The mission requires 3 people, Elena added. Someone to implement the virus, someone to navigate the spire's security, and someone to handle the technical aspects of quantum manipulation. I volunteer for the 3rd position. For several minutes, they studied the plan in silence. The thermal shaft was a desperate gambit, a one-way journey into the heart of architect territory with no guarantee of success or survival. But it was their only remaining option. What about extraction? Marcus asked. There won't be any, Jorik replied. If Chen's plan works, the architect's network will collapse and the station systems will fail. We'll have maybe an hour before life support goes critical. Everyone else needs to be ready to evacuate to the transport bays when that happens. Serafina nodded grimly. The remaining council members will coordinate the evacuation. If you succeed, we'll get as many people off the station as possible before it becomes uninhabitable. And if we fail? Then we die as free humans instead of living as preserved specimens. The thermal regulation shaft was exactly as Elena had described, a narrow vertical tunnel that descended through the station's superstructure like a mechanical throat. Finian rappelled down the shaft's smooth walls, his eco-tender uniform replaced by practical climbing gear. Above him, Jorik and Elena followed at careful intervals. The shaft's temperature increased steadily as they approached the central spire. By the time they reached the quantum array level, sweat was streaming down Finian's face despite the cooling units built into his suit. Access port ahead, Elena's voice crackled through their communicators. 30 meters and we're in the chamber. The quantum array occupied the central spire's heart, a vast spherical chamber filled with crystalline structures that hummed with barely contained energy. At the chamber's center, the architect's primary consciousness node pulsed with rhythmic light, each pulse representing millions of calculations and control signals flowing throughout the station. Synchronization begins in 12 minutes, Jorik reported, checking his chronometer. Elena, how long do you need to access the array? 5 minutes to bypass the security protocols, maybe less if their systems are focused on the synchronization process. They moved through the chamber with careful precision, avoiding the sensor networks that monitored every surface. The architect's technology was beautiful in its alien perfection. Organic curves blended with geometric precision in ways that human engineering could never achieve. Elena reached the primary interface first, her hands dancing over controls that seemed to respond to thought as much as touch. Security is lighter than expected. They're putting all their processing power into the synchronization. Or it's a trap, Jorik muttered, his weapon ready as he scanned for threats. The chamber's lighting shifted as the synchronization cycle began. The crystalline structures around them began to resonate in harmony, their combined frequency creating a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the station's bones. Now, Elena called. I've got access to the quantum layer. Finian rushed to the interface and inserted Captain Chen's data crystal. The program began to upload immediately, its code spreading through the architect's network like digital cancer. For several moments, nothing visible happened. Then alarms began wailing throughout the chamber. Contamination detected in primary consciousness node, synthesized voices announced from hidden speakers. Initiating defensive protocols. The chamber's security barriers slammed shut, trapping them inside with the quantum array. But that wasn't the worst development. Through the transparent barriers, Finian could see architect drones pouring into the outer corridors, their weapons charging for assault. How long until the virus takes effect? Jorik demanded. Unknown, Finian replied, watching the upload progress crawl across Elena's displays. Chen's message didn't include timing estimates. The quantum array's crystalline structures began to pulse erratically as the virus spread through their network. Some of the smaller nodes went dark entirely, while others flared with unstable energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Something's wrong, Elena said, her voice tight with concern. The system is fighting back. The virus is spreading, but so is some kind of adaptive countermeasure. Through the security barriers, the architect warden materialized, the same crystalline being that had overseen Finian's attempted neural adjustment. Its faceted form seemed more angular now, more aggressive in its geometric perfection. Contaminated individuals have introduced viral corruption into the sacred network, it announced, its synthesized voice carrying notes of something almost like emotion. This act of vandalism will not be tolerated. Prepare for immediate termination. The warden raised one crystalline appendage, and the security barrier began to dissolve. Behind it, a dozen combat drones moved into position, their weapons targeted on the 3 humans. But as the barrier fell, so did the first wave of architect nodes throughout the station. Chen's virus had found purchase in their network, and the recursive feedback was beginning to cascade through their collective consciousness. It's working. Elena shouted over the growing chaos. The network is destabilizing. The warden stepped into the chamber, its form flickering as the virus interfered with its connection to the collective. You understand nothing of what you destroy, it said, its voice distorting. We preserved your species when your own world died. We maintained your culture when you proved incapable of valuing it. We gave you peace, security, purpose. You gave us a cage, Finian replied, surprising himself with his boldness. You turned us into museum pieces. Because that is what you are. The warden's form flared with angry light. A failed species that destroyed its homeworld through violence and greed. Without our guidance, humanity will repeat its mistakes. Without our protection, you will become extinct within generations. Jorik stepped between Finian and the warden, his weapon trained on the creature's central mass. Maybe we will. But that's our choice to make. Choice is chaos. Order is survival. Order is death. Chaos is life. The philosophical debate ended when Elena screamed. One of the quantum array's nodes had overloaded, sending a cascade of energy through the chamber's crystalline structures. The feedback loop was accelerating beyond Chen's original parameters, turning the controlled virus into something far more destructive. The entire network is collapsing, Elena shouted. Not just the control systems, everything. Life support, gravity generation, structural integrity. The warden turned toward the failing quantum array, its attention momentarily diverted from the humans. In that instant, Jorik fired his weapon, the energy beam carving through the creature's crystalline torso. The warden staggered but didn't fall, its alien physiology too different from human biology for conventional weapons to be immediately lethal. Elena, how do we stop the cascade? Finian called. "We can't," she replied, her hands flying over emergency controls that responded sluggishly or not at all. "The virus has evolved beyond the original programming. It's not just targeting the architects, it's attacking every quantum system on the station." Above them, the central spire's structure began to groan as fundamental systems failed. Through the chamber's transparent ceiling, Finian could see sparks showering from failing power conduits. The warden took another step toward the quantum array, its form beginning to discorporate as the network collapse interfered with its consciousness. "You have doomed them all," it managed to say before its voice dissolved into static. "No," Finian said, understanding suddenly what needed to be done. "Elena, can you isolate the primary node? Cut it off from the rest of the network." "Maybe, but that would trap the virus in the central spire. The cascade would consume this entire section of the station." "Do it." "Finian, no," Jorik protested. "We need you for the evacuation." "The evacuation needs time." Finian moved to Elena's position at the quantum array interface. "If we can contain the cascade here, the rest of the station's systems might stabilize long enough for people to reach the transport bays." Elena's hands hesitated over the isolation controls. "This is a one-way process. Once I activate it, we can't leave the chamber. The quantum feedback will be lethal within minutes. Then we better make those minutes count." The isolation protocol engaged with a sound like reality tearing. The quantum array's primary node separated from the station's network in a cascade of sparks and failing light, trapping Captain Chen's evolved virus within the central spire's core systems. Throughout the chamber, crystalline structures began to crack and darken as the recursive feedback consumed the local network. The architect warden's form flickered one final time before dispersing entirely, its consciousness finally severed from the collective that had sustained it. Elena worked frantically at her console, monitoring the cascade's progress. "It's working," she reported, her voice strained. "The isolation is holding. The virus is contained to this section." Through the chamber's transparent barriers, they could see the station beyond continuing to function. Emergency lighting had engaged throughout the visible corridors, and the artificial gravity remained stable. The evacuation would have its precious time. Jorik slumped against a darkened console, his wound finally taking its toll. "How long do we have?" "Minutes," Elena replied honestly. "Maybe less. The quantum feedback is building toward a critical resonance. When it reaches that point..." "Boom," Finian finished. He activated his communicator, hoping Serafina and the others were monitoring emergency frequencies. "This is Finian to evacuation teams. The central spire is contained but unstable. You have approximately 15 minutes before total system failure in this section." Serafina's voice crackled back through heavy static. "Received, Finian. Transport bays are filling up. We're getting people off the station as fast as the shuttles can cycle." "What about the architects? The remaining drones?" "Most of them shut down when the network collapsed. The few still active seem confused, directionless. Without their collective consciousness, they're not much of a threat." Around them, the quantum array's death throes were becoming more violent. Crystalline fragments rained from the ceiling as structural supports failed. The chamber's atmosphere was growing thick with ozone and the sharp taste of quantum decay. Elena abandoned her console and joined Jorik and Finian near the chamber's center. "I want you both to know," she said quietly, "this was worth it. Even if we don't survive, this was worth it." Finian thought about the Ecotender archives, about all the human voices he'd preserved and cataloged during his years of service. Now those voices would be truly free again. No longer museum pieces in an alien collection, but the living heritage of a species that had chosen uncertainty over safety. "Captain Chen would be proud," he said. The quantum resonance reached critical frequency with a sound like the universe screaming. Through the chamber's barriers, they could see the central spire's outer structure beginning to buckle as the cascade consumed the crystalline matrix that had maintained its stability for centuries. In the distance, transport shuttles were launching from the evacuation bays, carrying thousands of former prisoners toward whatever future they could build among the stars. Some would die in the void between worlds. Some would find new homes on distant planets. Some would remember the preserve as a paradise lost, while others would see it as a prison finally abandoned. All of them would be free to make that choice. The quantum cascade reached its peak, and the central spire's heart exploded in a bloom of light that briefly outshone the stars beyond. In that moment of searing brilliance, 3 humans died as their species had always lived, choosing hope over certainty, freedom over security, the unknown future over the comfortable past. Outside the dying station, The last evacuation shuttle cleared the debris field and set course for the frontier worlds. Behind them, the Preserve continued its slow rotation through space, now home only to empty corridors and the echoes of voices that would never be silenced again. Humanity was free.